In today's gospel reading, Jesus makes sure that we know what to do when we get invited to Taylor Swift's wedding. And notice I said Taylor's wedding, not the Taylor-Kelsey wedding. But he does not mention my personal favorite party strategy, which is just standing quietly in the corner and hoping that there's a dog at the party that I can pet instead of having to talk to people. I was sitting with all of these scriptures this week, and I admit I feel a little tired. And not just because, yes, I did spend all yesterday at DragonCon. I am tired of politicians that claim to speak for all Christians and disrespect the working folks. I'm tired of hearing so much about Leviticus and Deuteronomy when folks want to go after LGBTQ folks, and so little about passages like the one Chris read for us this morning, where God demands we pay workers a living wage and stop wage theft, insists that we do not deprive a resident alien of justice, which means no masked men tossing them in a van and sending them to El Salvador without due process, calls us to care for the widow and the orphan, the people who cannot work and still deserve human dignity. I get tired of propaganda that tries to pit us against each other, people who work versus people who don't or can't but still deserve benefits, people who have official papers versus people who don't, when God lumps them all together here and lumps their welfare all together and doesn't set them against each other. I'm tired of huge posters of a wannabe pharaoh draped over a Department of Labor that's cutting worker protections, turning all workers into near slaves like we were in Egypt, as God says. Tired of AI being forced down the throats of all of us, even though AI is essentially dependent upon near slave labor inputting stuff and destroying God's creation to fuel its energy consumption. Tired of children being put to death for the sins of their parents because they have not done anything about assault weapons and gun epidemics in our country. Tired of folks condemning entire groups of people when there's a mass shooting, labeling trans folks or immigrants or black or brown folks, and when it's a shooter, it looks like someone like me, they say, oh no, that's just one individual who's going through a hard time, even though most shootings in this country are carried out by people who look like me. Tired of people I love working themselves to the bone and still struggling to pay their bills. Tired of the way that the problems in our families and the problems our young people experience and the violence in our streets, these things don't magically go away if we get paid more or it wasn't so expensive to live, but it would sure help. Money cannot buy happiness, but poverty can destroy it pretty quick. I am tired. I bet you are too. But when I get tired, I usually have an unhealthy amount of caffeine. And then, if that doesn't help, I look to Jesus. And I look to what it means to say that the Most High God, the divine, the eternal, the source of the universe itself, was this person who walked among the poor and loved the marginalized and outcast and shamed. This Jesus who stood up for and defended the poor and said nothing to condemn LGBTQ folks. Jesus who was willing to suffer instead of killing anyone. Jesus who did not come to earth just to get us into heaven, but to start the process of turning this earth into something that looks more like heaven. Who did not just come to undo what happened in Genesis, but to repeat and expand on what happened in Exodus, to free all of us from the sin and patterns that we get stuck in that look a lot like slavery in Egypt, making endless bricks for a Pharaoh that does not love us. Jesus who promises to wipe every tear from every eye, to interrupt our ugly ways with God's dream for a better way to live together. I think of Jesus, who helps us sort through these confusing sections of the Old Testament, figure out which ones to make authoritative over our lives and which ones cannot serve that purpose, by asking which ones reflect his life and his teachings, and using that as the lens through which to read all of Scripture. So yes, in our gospel reading today, Jesus gives us great party advice. Gives us great party advice in an era in which there was an emphasis on honor and shame, on relationships of service and domination, where you couldn't just quit your job and start over. You were, for the most part, embedded in some sort of social hierarchy with folks above and below you, and usually for life. And so, yeah, that's the context. Jesus is saying, hey, don't just sit at the places of honor. Be smart. Be humble. Let people invite you into a better spot. These are wise words for all of us, even today in a different culture. Whenever we are meeting someone new, encountering a new topic, new people, don't walk into every conversation assuming you know everything. Don't walk into every room assuming you're smarter and better than everyone in that room. It may turn out that you're an expert, that you know a lot about something, but that is something that will emerge over time. You don't need to walk in and force everybody to acknowledge you right off the bat. And you are free, I guess, to go into every conversation with your coworkers, with your family, with people who disagree with you about politics, and assume you already have it all figured out, and that you have nothing to learn from these folks. But that sounds like a dreadfully boring way to live. So these are wise words from Jesus about how to handle not only parties, but every social interaction. And they are wise words, but they are also radical words. Because you'll notice that today's reading had a bit from verse 1 of chapter 14, then it skipped ahead to 7 through 14, right? And that verse 1 is important because it sets the context for how disruptive Jesus is of the entire status quo. He didn't just pull his disciples aside at a random moment and say, here's how to behave when you're at a social event. Okay? No, he went to the leader of a house of Pharisees, and when he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, that's when he jumped in. He walked into the house of a respected community leader, and he called out all the high and mighty folks there on their pretensions. It's as if he walked into the annual banquet of the Chamber of Commerce and said, hey, nice party you have here. I see you have great seats for the executives and the shareholders, for the bosses and business leaders. Where are the places of honor for the folks who work for you? For the people who make the profits possible? For the delivery drivers and the night shift nurses? For the people working overtime just to make ends meet? Are you saying they had nothing to do with the success of your business? Jesus doesn't just flip over tables in his time on earth. He comes to flip the whole world upside down. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all those who humble themselves will be exalted. There's a whole lot of people today who reserve the seats of honor in our society for CEOs and cisgender men, for the S&P 500 and the AR-15s. And they are going to be real surprised when Jesus starts humbling the exalted. They are going to be real humbled when Jesus starts exalting today's humble. And now, none of this means that we hate the rich, hate bosses. I would love for all of you to be rich. I would love a CEO, especially a CEO who wants to come to a small, historic Atlanta church and tithe 10% of their dramatic income. That would be marvelous. But what we're talking about is critique of a system, a critique of a structure of a society itself. There was a Harvard Business Review study, right, that asked people, how much do you think a CEO should make? How much more than your worker? And they said, okay, generally people say that a CEO should make about 7 times what an unskilled worker at their company makes, that would be fair, okay? And then they said, well, what do you think the ratio is today? And they said, well, we think that CEOs make about 30 times what an unskilled worker makes. That's unfair, and we think that should change. Turns out that the actual estimate is that a CEO makes 340 times, 10 times more, what their workers do. So 30 was already considered unfair. The reality is 340. That's not the fault of one company or executive. We cannot be mean to individual people who are trapped in a system. That is something that calls for collective repentance on the part of a society that says we have gotten this badly wrong. Jesus confronted that kind of inequality among us, and he calls us to be his co-worker in confronting that kind of inequality in our own day. He is alongside us, giving us energy when we have to get through a double shift, giving us peace when we're at our wits' end with our boss or our customers. And yeah, he is with us, walking alongside us when we stand up and raise our voices for better wages, safer conditions, and more dignity for all human beings. So when I get tired, I remember Jesus, and also all the people Jesus has inspired. We are celebrating Labor Day. We are celebrating Labor Sunday. Labor Day, many people know, grew out of the industrial strikes of the last Gilded Age prior to this one. And you may know some of this history, but what not enough people know is how churches supported and emboldened those unions and those working people and everyone struggling for their rights. For instance, our new pope is named Pope Leo. Okay? The last pope prior to this one to be named Leo was the author of this fantastic document about the rights and dignity of workers in a new industrial modernizing age. He wrote that in 1891. And some observers have said that the reason this new pope came along and said, I want to be named Leo, is because he's calling attention to the way that unjust laws and technology and unbridled greed have combined to produce yet again the same conditions in our society. By 1909, so more than 100 years ago, both the American Federation of Labor and the Federal Council of Churches considered Labor Sunday, the Sunday before Labor Day, an official part of the church calendar. By 1910, a business magnate was so scared of how popular this had gotten that he took out ads in the front page of newspapers all across the country warning that labor organizers were hoodwinking clergymen by supporting them for their cause. Here in the South, in the 1930s, there was something called the Fellowship of Southern Churchmen that promoted the rights of workers, promoted cooperative businesses, promoted worker-owned cooperatives, group purchasing agreements, reflected upon the economic roots of racial violence. And yes, it got torn apart through civil rights and the Red Scare, but that radical history was there. In the 1960s, King called not only for civil rights, but also for economic freedom and economic democracy for all people. Liberation theology emerged out of the struggles of working campesinos in Latin America and has led us to reflect on the way that every marginalized group in most modern societies would benefit from confronting unjust economic systems. And so what I try to remember when I get tired is that while churches have not always followed the way of Jesus, while some churches have dodged the cross and baptized empires of wealth and privilege, alongside that, for over 2,000 years, there has been this constant other stream that cannot seemingly be quashed because it seems part and central to Jesus' message itself. Groups of people standing up for the rights of the people around them, of working folks, of folks who cannot work, of people crushed, pushed down, and cast aside. For 2,000 years, ordinary people have looked to our faith to stand up for a dream of a better world. They have looked to Jesus, the center of our faith, and it has given them courage to confront impossible odds. So if you ever get tired, remember, we have been here before, and we do not walk through any moment alone. We walk with Christ beside us, suffering alongside us, calling us forward, granting us peace, granting us energy, offering us hope, and enveloping us, yes, in his amazing, amazing grace.